Dear students, welcome Hoshamdeep and Hosh Galdanis. Today I am going to discuss a new topic with you, that is from the history of English literature. Today we are going to discuss modernist poetry and poets. So our today's topic is modernist poetry and poets. My video is or rather better to say this topic is divided in two parts. In part 1 I'm going to discuss with you the features and trends of modernist English poetry, and in second part of this video we are going to discuss, or in the second part of this topic we are going to discuss the prominent poets of the modernist age. So let's start our discussion. Here you can see the contents, and in the contents we have just represented the two sections of this topic clearly. Today we are going to discuss part 1, features of modernist English poetry. Modernist age is the mixture of conventional and experimental poetry, particularly the earlier phase of the modernist poetry. The Georgian poets followed old paradigms of poetry, means they were some of them they were inspired of the romantic regime of poetry, and some of them they were inspired of the earlier and later Victorian poetry. So the Georgian poets, they followed old paradigms of the poetry in the wake of modernist era or modern era. This was actually started in the later Victorian era, means this sort of poetry was started or was come in fashion in the later Victorian era. So the modernist traits can be seen in the later Victorian poetry as well. It is multifaceted and complex in its nature, with versatilities of themes and contents. It is simply a complicated paradigm. So, in order to understand the modernist poetry and modernist literature, you have to go through a lot of things in order to understand, in order to go through the crux of the modernist English literature as well as modernist English poetry. As I have already told you that it is multifaceted and complex, so you can find multiple themes in modernist poetry, and those themes are the results of different movements within modernist age and modernist movement, and within modernist art and literature. So it is multifaceted and complex in its nature, with versatilities of themes and contents. It simply changes and debunks the old notions of love for nature. And the actual modernist poetry, you won't find any sort of celebration of beauty and celebration of nature exactly as you find in the romantic paradigm of poetry. Modern poetry is free of romantic zeal and metaphysical zest. So, a few of the poets, you can find them inspired of some of the romantic ideals and some of the metaphysical ideals, and they have a study of all those poets, but only a few of them they find some kind of inspiration from romanticism and metaphysical poetry. You won't find them following exactly the romantic zeal and metaphysical zest within their themes and diction of poetry, that is actually known as modernist poetry. It is simply ignorant of the effects of musicality and lyricism. Modernist poetry is considered complicated and complex because, as I have already told you, that modernist poetry is a bit complicated and complex. How it becomes complex? due to the effects of multiple movements like imagism, symbolism, impressionism, expressionism, and those movements have so deeply affected the themes, dictions, and contents of modernist English poetry that they don't bother for musicality and lyricism anymore in the modernist poetry. Although you can find a kind of lyricism, they have their own terms and conditions for writing the poetry. They have brought innovation in lyricism and musicality of the poetry as well, but they do not focus on the musicality and lyricism particularly. Their focus is on a lot of things. Well, it is simply ignorant of the effects of musicality in lyricism. Means the modernist poetry, it doesn't bother for the beauty of lyrics and the beauty of musicality in the poetry, yet it plays on its own terms in the art of poetic creations. Modernist poetry flows under the influence of many things, and including World War. So the World War has made a very horrible effect on modernist poetry. That's why uh, we can't find, and we shouldn't expect this sort of uh, ideology that focuses on lyricism and musicality, because war, we all, as we all know, that the world wars are full of the brutalities and atrocities. So the modernist age has witnessed all those atrocities and all those horrible things happen during the war. So we cannot expect any sort of sublimity and artificial musicality, lyricism, and loftiness in modernist literature and in modernist poetry. However, modernist poetry has its own way of creating lyricism, as well as the artistic effects and the aesthetic effects. It has its own kind of aesthetic effects on the minds of the readers. In modernist poetry and in the whole lot of modernist literature, we can find suffering and disillusionment as the primary issues and as the primary themes of modernist poetry, particularly the poetry of T.S. Eliot and the poetry of Philip Larkin, Shimasini. We can find actually the burning issues of the time in their poetry instead of the romantic songs and the songs of beauty. So, due to the effects of war, we can find suffering and disillusionment as the primary themes of modernist poetry. But modernist representations are totally different than the old schools of English poetry. The blessings of avant-garde movement have enriched the form and contents of modernist literature. All of us have some idea of avant-garde movement. That was the movement of aesthetic arts. So under the effects of these this sort of this school, this avant-gardian thought, there are multiple sort of ideologies and movements in art and as well as in literature. So the blessings of avant-garde have enriched the form and contents of modernist literature as well as modernist poetry, as it has cherished many movements in art and literature of modern era. When we probe deep into the phenomenon of modernist poetry, we find it inspired of many sort of modernist movements like impressionism, expressionism, symbolism. So where impressionism enables the artists and writers in a clearly ambiguous way to lead towards the reality in the text, so they have their own way to probe deep into the text. They compel the reader to go to the core of the text to reach to the ultimate meanings they want to convey. So, where Impressionism enables the artists and writers in a clearly ambiguous way to lead towards the reality in the text, there, symbolism refers to another kind of representation, and symbolism refers to representation in using symbolic features. For example, the dark backgrounds in the poetic creations and in dramas, it shows the darkness and mystery of a character. And then imagism is another movement, and as we all know that imagism is cherished by Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, it leads to a scientific use of exact expressions to elaborate any physical object or event. This is the easiest definition for imagism. For the understanding of imagism, that it leads to a scientific use of exact impressions to elaborate any physical object or event. It does not allow any word that has no contribution in representation. So this is a simple and appropriate definition of imagism, because normally we confuse imagism with romanticism, but there is a hell of difference between romanticism and imagism. Imagism is a bit scientific as compared to romanticism. So, imagism is a bit scientific in its nature. It scientifically explains the physical objects and physical events and incidents with the help of words. It doesn't allow any word that has no contribution in the representation of that very object or that very event or incident. It can not be confused with romanticism. Hence, modern poetry or modernist poetry is the poetry of revolt and experimentation. Experimentation with poetic form, diction, and themes, as well as with the contents of the poetry. Modernist poetry or modern poetry is highly influenced by science, but it doesn't show any appreciation for scientific and technological inventions in the backdrop of world wars. Yes, this is a very terrific or horrible reality that although modernist poetry is so full of revolt and experimentation with poetic form and diction, and they are highly influenced by the emerging trends of science, but we can't find the celebration of technological advancements in modernist literature. Rather, we find them mourning and discouraging the modernist technologies because of the technological advancement in the development of different sort of arms and weapons. So the modernist poetry, we can't show modernist poetry, or we cannot witness it showing any sort of celebration of the modernist technological inventions, particularly that are related to the arms. However, they write on each and every type of thing that serves lives. Even they write poems on automobiles. Like there is a famous poem of Philip Larkin on ambulance, if I'm not wrong. Yes, on ambulance. So he highlights the uses of ambulance and what sort of purposes it serves, and what sort of senses and notions we can get from the sirens of the ambulance or of the sounds of the ambulance. So modernist, that's how modernist themes are scientific and technological, but in the backdrop of the world wars, they normally don't show any sort of celebration of the modernist technological advancements. Modernist writers and poets are highly realistic, and hence realism is a chief feature of modern poetry and literature. In the wake of World War, we find poetry of modern age full of broken images of English life. means of modernist society and modernist life, post World War life. After World War, there was a time of specifically Depression era, and that very time period is also known as Depression era literature, and that is this time period is specifically Depression era in literature and poetry. So during that time, the type of literature that was written and the type of poetry that was produced, it is known as the Depression era literature or Depression era poetry. In this type of poetry, we can find gloom, pathos, depression, alienation, and fragmentation as the prominent themes and features of that poetry and those poems, of those poems. So, in this way, modernist poetry is bitter and pessimistic due to the effects of world wars and due to the atrocities and the horrible outcomes of the world wars. It shows the broken and wounded consciousness of modern poets. Eliot's The Wasteland is an example of the pathetic picture of modern society in modernist life. There is nothing like sentimental in modernist poetry, means to say that like love and the particularly the platonic sort of love, you can't find this type of sentimentalism and this sort of romanticism in modernist poetry. However, in Victorian era you can find such sort of themes, but not in the modernist poetry. You can't find that sort of that platonic sort of romance in modernist poetry. Man had lost faith in morality and even in the moral and humanitarian values, and this is the focal theme of modernist poetry. And again, The Wasteland is a very beautiful example, a very wonderful example of this very thing, the lack of morality and the loss of moral values and humanitarian values. And the result of science and technological advancements, the poets of modern age sound skeptic about God and religion. So it was again war that had caused the skepticism, and then the science and technological advancement that had caused the skepticism, and they often sound skeptic about God and religion. Modernist literature has remained unable to celebrate technological advancements due to the wars and arms, means weapons. However, the constant experimentation with form, diction, and themes is the blessing of many art movements like Impressionism, Imagism, and Surrealism. So, this is all about the major features or the prominent trends, features, and themes of the modernist literature and of modernist poetry. See you in the next part of the video that is based on the discussion on the prominent and representative modernist poets. Thank you so much for today. Allah Hafiz.